I'm Candace Charlton. I am a business development manager in the VC and startups team, and welcome to this panel session today on fueling innovation in the government through startups. And I wanted to get a really quick, just show of hands of who we have here in the audience in terms of, and if multiple categories apply to you, just a quick show of hands so that our panelists know. Are you here representing the government or public policy generally? Okay. How about industry and particularly partners working with, or as a partner working with the public sector? Okay. Are you, and within that, are you with a startup, by whatever definition you would use to? And are you a startup working with the public sector currently? So, all right, great. So we got a really good mix. So for decades, the public sector has led innovation across a multitude of categories, geospatial, medicine, cybersecurity, advanced analytics, and more. And with the advent of cloud computing as a factor fueling the rise of startups that are producing some really amazing and cutting-edge technology, the government is realizing that it's got to embrace advancements not necessarily developed or supported through its own programs like DARPA, NIST, NIH, and NASA. And so today, we want to listen to a panel of leaders within the commercial and public sector to discuss how they're partnering to access and co-develop these capabilities faster through startups and bring that innovation to the government. So we'll hear how organizations are using startup technology for tech scouting, prototyping, piloting, and ultimately production deployments to better serve the warfighter, to enable citizen services, and counter violence, for instance. So I want to start by asking each panelist, and we can go from this side down, to just give a brief introduction, tell us your name, your role, the organization you're with, and just a short description of that organization. So we'll start with Peter.
Thank you. I'm Peter Dixon. I'm the CEO of Second Front Systems. We are a lightweight systems integrator based in Silicon Valley. That's something that used to exist there actually in great number 30 years ago, but has been pretty absent from the scene for the last few decades. And I should also mention that this is public now. We just had hit the news that we've received an offer to be acquired by a large cybersecurity company called Qualys.
Great, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. My name is Andy Baer. I'm a partner with Sway Ventures. We're a venture capital firm headquartered in San Francisco. I run the Washington office, do a lot of work with our portfolio companies and of course the U.S. government. Also partners with AWS and their public sector group and working on venture and frontier technologies, as Candace mentioned, in medicine, aerospace, AI, ML, analytics, and computer vision.
Hi everyone, I'm Varun Vira. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, also known as C4ADS. We do investigative research on transnational illicit networks, so that's everything from North Korean sanctions evasion to wildlife trafficking. But it's working very closely with agencies like U.S. Treasury, Commerce, Defense, et cetera, to provide the type of information that helps identify, disrupt, and ultimately dismantle those networks.
Hello everyone, my name is Brendan Siecko. I'm the founder and CEO of QZM. At QZM, we help museums, nonprofits, and cultural organizations engage their members, visitors, and donors through the power of technology. We most recently partnered with AWS Public Sector on a project for the White House Historical Association to extend the type of work that we do even deeper into the ecosystem.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, we've got a good mix of leaders with experience in startups, sourcing those cutting edge solutions for the public sector, investors in those solutions. So I want to get a conversation going now, and let's just set one tiny ground rule. We all know the process of working with the government and the public sector generally can be very challenging, to say the least. So we want to focus here with the panelists and then with Q&A that'll follow. Let's talk about what is working, the positive aspects of that, and not get into like a therapy session on how difficult it can be. So I want to start off, first question is to you, Peter.
Yeah.
I think we'd all agree that throughout the history of our country, the government has had its hand in advancing technology, creating new markets, and driving significant economic growth, whether it be space program, the internet, the industrial revolution, or medicine. Do you believe this will continue to be the case, given how markets are changing and new markets are popping up more rapidly, including those born out of the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're going to start to see now from government kind of going on to the next 10 years will be something. So when we look at adversary nation states or enemy forces, right? One of the things that we like to differentiate between is exemplar units, right? Showpiece units, where they may have a higher level of technical sophistication, and understanding where that technology has actually proliferated across the rank and file, right? And so I think one of the things that we've been in danger of in the US is having what some people will call innovation theater, or we see it in Silicon Valley with sort of tech tourism. But it's a lot of really, in some cases, really good pilots and prototypes that are being done. But the connective tissue to make sure that those are actually transitioning, being sustained, going into programs of record has in recent history been lacking, right? And so I think most of us are kind of in the government or national security community. The common name for that, right, is the valley of death, right? It's this dearth of program activity and money in between that innovation activity, right, and where, quote, kind of the real dollars are kept locked inside programs of record. And so the space, how long is that valley of death? It's 105 months long for average fielding between a RFI, right, and initial fielding for a program of record. And so, when you looked at kind of why is this occurring, why is, for instance, Israel's tech sector, where you have the Defense Department, basically their national security community and their tech sector are overlapped. Obviously, they've structured their society in a different way than ours. But you see that here, BRAC closed down kind of the 16 military bases in Silicon Valley. And so a lot of that connective tissue has disappeared. Belatedly, I think the US government has kind of realized that. And so one of the things that's particularly exciting is you see a lot of new authorities that have been given to the military and other organizations within the national security community. We talk a little bit about what those are, especially if folks are interested in that. But that is providing single sole source justification to a lot of those companies that have done those pilots and prototypes so that you'll actually see it sustained.
Great, thank you. Andy, same question to you, and give us your take from the lens of a venture capitalist. Why would a VC care?
Sure, no, thanks for the question, and it's a good question. I guess there are kind of a couple of trends going on, which I'm sure everyone sees, and I'll just try to provide a little bit of, let's say, focus on a couple of those issues. First, as Peter points out, there's been a long-term relationship between the U.S. government and startups, particularly in Silicon Valley, but other tech centers as well, which in some cases has kind of ebbed and flowed. And to his point with the BRAC closures, that had a significant impact, I think. That said, I think just in the last several years, certainly the U.S. government, and particularly more so, let's call it the national security community here, because they tend to be a little more acquisitive in terms of technology and faster moving than some of the other departments, but nevertheless, have begun to see, I think, a real need to integrate, obviously, innovation, new technologies, even disruptive technologies. And so there's, as I'm sure you all see and know, a pretty strong effort now to kind of rematch those coasts. That is the East Coast, where we are now with the West Coast and Silicon Valley, and the tech centers that are certainly in Texas and in Austin, Boston, and other places, Colorado, et cetera. And so I think that's an important trend that's going on, and there's, I think, even more effort to try to now get that together with some of the procurement authorities which have been put in place or now reactivated, like OTA, which I think probably Peter you're referring to, as well as some of the organizations that have been stood up like DIUX that are now proliferated around the country. One thing I'll say, though, kind of specifically on startups and from our standpoint as a venture investor, and that is, we're not specifically focused on purely national security or even government technologies. We're focused on frontier technologies, as I mentioned in my intro. So, but there are a lot of overlaps there, of course, you would expect. And so let's say a good portion of our portfolio companies are interested in doing work with the U.S. government. And for good reason, we obviously want to enable that because we think that they have a lot to contribute. One thing I'll still mention, though, which is, I think, kind of interesting, and I'd like to get the group's reaction here to this, and that is all companies at some point, even Google and Amazon, were startups at one point, right? And so what I've seen really over the last several years is a trend which is almost contrarian in some ways, which I find very interesting. Again, I'd like to get some reaction here if there are thoughts, and that is that for 70-odd years, the U.S. government and other national governments, for that matter, had what I would call a monopoly on national technical means, particularly when it came to national security. That's surveillance, intelligence, monitoring, et cetera, through very sophisticated technologies. In some ways, that's now flip-flopped. And what I mean by that, as an example, if you were, let's say, an intelligence officer 25 years ago or a special forces officer out in the field and you had the benefit of internet connectivity and you had an Apple iPhone or any other smart device handheld with all the functionality and capability in that little box, it would be the most amazing capability that they had seen at that time. So think fast forward about, now we all think of this as just, an everyday device, but then it was really amazing and quite capable and would have enabled all kinds of things which, we can do every day now. In addition to that, as an example, I'm sure there's some jealousies over at Fort Meade about what Google has and, what they have the ability to do deep analytics on and their ability to, run analysis, et cetera. So those things, I think, are now beginning to kind of, in some ways, balance what we're doing. And there's now, I think, not only, of course, large firms like AWS and some of the others, which we all know about, but also the small firms are now seeing that trend as well. And the government and particularly, again, as I said, national security, want to consume those and take advantage of them because they do see the power of their ability to bring new capability to the equation.
Great, thank you. So two mentions now of an OTA, and just for anyone who might not know what that is, that stands for Other Transaction Authority, and that is it's a rule that refers to the authority for the Department of Defense to fast track and carry out certain prototype projects. So Andy, let's stay with you. The sales cycle, we've talked about this. You said 105 months. That's longer than I even realized. But let's talk, Andy, about these rapid prototype methods. Are OTAs as a method for government commercial markets to work together the best path? Is that the path of least resistance? And what other methods are you seeing specifically?
So you mentioned kind of, I think, two things there which are relevant. One is rapid equipping, and that's actually specifically, I think you may be referring to what was and still is actually a U.S. Army function. So there's an office in the U.S. Army called the Rapid Equipment Office, which was started under Secretary Perry. And now I think, if I get the number right, is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500 million, it could be more, of rapid procurement authority, which allows then the Pentagon to get the warfighter, particularly in contingency operations like Afghanistan and Iraq and others, very, very quick supply of goods and services, which would take, under normal circumstances, months or years to provide. In addition to that, there's been now a revival of this Other Transactional Authority, which has been developed to allow also rapid procurement in the course of, let's say, 60, 90 days. And there are a number of different customers, end user customers in the military services, but not just focused on the Pentagon or national security. It's with VA, DHS, and other organizations, DOE, other agencies. I think there are 7 total that have Other Transactional Authority and the ability to then procure goods and services in a short period of time, which really does circumvent the opportunity, or let's say the challenge really of long-term procurement, because we've heard lots of our companies ask us about doing business with the government, and we say, typically, and this is not certainly the rule, but typically, this can be 12 to 18 months just in a procurement cycle for one contract, and a lot of companies that we talk to say, well, we could be dead by then, right? So, we need something to go faster, and so Other Transactional Authority and some of these other capabilities providing a little faster market strategy and bring to market for their products and services.
Yeah, 2373 also, which is separate from Other Transaction Authority for the government folks in the room, is also extremely effective, and they have a whole bunch of different categories that they've allowed under that, where you can act basically on commercial terms. Because if you're dealing with a startup, right, and you're not able to act within an 18-month cycle for that startup's next funding round, you may as well not exist, right? The other thing with the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, I think that there's been a lot of focus on the production part of that, but as part and parcel of it, it specifically says if you have, under Other Transaction prototyping, if you have done a competitive award of a prototype and it's been successfully fielded, then that gives you single sole source justification. That's not only for production OTs, that's also for under the FAR, right? So if you have another transaction prototype and if you are doing business with the government, you should direct them to one of the consortiums that does it, something like the Commercial Solution Opening from DIUX, right? The Army's getting it now, it's proliferated to special operations. Once you have one of those prototypes, you should work to create a single sole source justification package that you can then take to other government partners and acquisition officers who may not understand it to help pull your tech into those different mission partners as well.
And Candace, I'll mention one other point, because I know you want to move on to some of the others as well, but just on this, and that is that from the investment side, we all are, I'm sure, familiar with InQtel.
Yeah.
Pentagon's considering the same type of organization, and I think that there are other agencies that are also thinking about how they can invest in technologies, not just acquire them, but invest in them and enable them and accelerate them as well. So I think that's a trend which we're going to see more of as well.
Great, thank you. So Varun, what Andy and Peter are talking about sounds like it's, it's the secret code to actually working with the public sector. Tell us what it's like to be a relatively small company working with the public sector. What motivates you the most to be persistent and deal with this complexity?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think what drives us is the mission, right? I mean, that's why we're sort of in the nonprofit sector rather than the private sector side. I think what we see is, at least in our space, in the kind of threat finance space, is that the government is actually trying to become a lot more nimble, become a lot more flexible than it is, and kind of piggybacking what Andy just said, I think in our space there is, that inversion has really sort of happened already, right? Where a lot more of the data, the technology, the analytics that you need to conduct this type of work is actually in the private sector or the public, in the private sector side of things, right? So just inherently when you're starting, I think government is trying to move in that direction, trying to find sort of more nimble, more flexible solutions that they can sort of tag on. And I think the other piece is, they're trying to sort of shift away to a certain degree from these sort of bespoke, full implementation type systems, right? I mean, I think one of the big advantages we have as sort of a nonprofit on the outside is we want to be the best at what we do. We're very small, don't necessarily have the resources. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel each time, right? We're trying to take stuff off the shelf, adapt, mix and match, and see what kind of works best. And that allows us to kind of leapfrog ahead, right? We can start from the best of what somebody else has done and then build on that rather than go back to sort of basics and rebuild the entire system. So I find it actually very stimulating to come to your question actually right now, where I feel that a lot of people in our sector right now have the opportunity to kind of lead, to show a little bit of what's possible, what's available. And I'd like to believe that the government is starting to follow in a lot of these directions, and when they tag it onto the capabilities they have, I think you're going to come out with just a much more flexible, much more powerful capability than what's available.
Great, thank you. And I like what you said about being motivated by the mission, because I do hear that a lot with working with the public sector. And Brendan, how about you? What motivates you to work within this complexity?
It's absolutely the mission. I mean, we want to have a social impact, and I think a lot of entrepreneurs have kind of opened their eyes to what you can do in business that is more pervasive in improving people's life, improving access to education. And so we look at museums, cultural institutions, and these nonprofits as being shepherds of our world's culture. They protect it, they preserve it, they make it accessible for the public to learn from and to interact with. And if we can in any way, shape, or form help these institutions, these organizations be more successful in meeting their own mission by unblocking some of the things that have been challenging, that's what we're here to do. And if 50% of IT projects fail, there's a study that CIO does, that is shocking, it's frustrating, and to think that these or any organizations would be faced with some of the most technically challenging things, we want to be there to help them deliver upon their mission using the latest, the greatest technology and making it really easy for them. That's a really big part of this.
Sure. Right, and what you just mentioned about the high rate of failure there. So Andy and I have talked about how VCs accept that risk to some extent, but the public sector, these customers we're talking about, can't. So do you feel like there's more pressure to actually get it right the first time? And I'm interested in hearing more tactically about how you actually started doing this work. Was it through prototypes or pilots? How did you actually navigate that system specifically?
Yeah, I mean, everything we do has a very agile methodology behind it, and we try to instill that mindset in the institutions that we work with to show that you can start gaining value from these small iterative steps in any type of implementation or project that you have. I mean, we're 3.5 years old, we're venture funded, we work with over 150 institutions, so we've seen a lot, we've learned a lot, and we want to share those best practices with the institutions that we work with. So a lot of prototyping.
Sure.
I don't think you can succeed in this day and age unless you're prototyping and validating ideas, and there's, now more than ever, you hear an interest or an acceptance of failure. You know, fail fast, fail forward is something you wouldn't necessarily hear in the public sector or in the nonprofit world, and today you are. And that's really promising because it shows kind of a new eye towards innovation.
Right. And, you know, one of the things that with your startup or your company in particular is you've brought something that's been appealing to the consumer market to the public sector. And the issue of convincing these museums and libraries and associations that manage and own these memorials that have this lasting engagement. There's something there about that younger generation particularly wants that more personalized experience. Did you have any problem convincing these institutions that have been around for, you know, hundreds of years that was a good thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I said it was easy to convince a 100-year-old institution that is based, you know, based on historic and historic culture, kind of these institutions that treasure the past versus look at the future. For most cases, there are always exceptions to the rule. But there's no denying the power that mobile and digital have in this day and age. And the differentiation between digital strategy and just typical strategy has really started to dissolve. And you look at just even our interactions daily, we see the world, we communicate, we socialize, and we share and learn all through our mobile devices. And so it took a little bit of time in getting you know, the nonprofit and the cultural sector to be faster moving in adopting these technologies, but it's the type of thing where once you have enough case studies and enough success stories, people are eager to learn. They're more visitor and consumer-centric than they had been in decades past.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Andy, tell us a little bit about how your firm mentors your portfolio companies to actually work with the public sector. Do you do specific tactical things there?
Sure, yeah, good question. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of portfolio companies that do want to do work with U.S. government, or for that matter, state and local government, and some that don't. So, of course, to Candace's question, when talking to, mentoring, coaching those companies, we kind of counsel a number of different principles and ideas. Number one, of course, not surprisingly, is patience. And I think that's, you know, pretty obvious on its face, but to the points that have been made earlier, there is still, nevertheless, regardless of the more recent developments in procurement authority and those kinds of things, still, I think, a virtue in patience. And so that's got to be part of it. In fact, just on that point, I'll mention that there are a number of programs, as we all know, which can last, if not years, even sometimes decades. And really, which is pretty amazing. And really, there is some benefit to that, of course, for the companies, either the primes or the vendors or the subcontractors that support them. And that is that if you get in the channel and you can stay in the channel, then there will be long-term benefit. And that's really kind of the upside, because if you want to do business with the U.S. government in any facet or any dimension, then you have to, as I said, have patience. And secondly then, however, on the other hand, if you do and you can kind of see your way through, then the benefits can be substantial. And I think that's really one of the major opportunities, not just in terms of what I would call dollar volume and contract longevity and annuity, but at the same time also opportunity, because you get exposed to things you may not see in the private sector. That's kind of one set of issues. The second set of issues is, of course, and that is that there's a different way of doing business. There's a different culture. You know, with most commercial firms, and this kind of just generalized to make the point, but you know, you have an initial engagement, a briefing, they evaluate the product, some time goes by, you sign a contract, and you know, that's really kind of the procurement cycle. In government, it's a lot different. There are now a number of different constituencies and stakeholders you have to work with, program managers, contracting officers, end users, you know, all kinds of other people that are in the supply chain that are important and actually need to not only make decisions, but you know, need to also kind of get the sell, so to speak. And so there's a more complex, let's say, process and sales cycle in that. And then finally, I would say that really one of the things that we find most interesting, that is really the sectors they want to be in. And there are some traditional ones, as we would all expect, like cyber as an example, which is now you know, clearly traditional. There are many non-traditional sectors which a lot of companies don't realize they can really play a role in, because of course the U.S. government procures a lot of product and service every year, and so helping them think through how they can then be customer facing and provide a variety of different capabilities for what may be traditional as well as non-traditional customers in the government.
Great, thank you. Varun, what are your thoughts on that? What do you wish someone had told you, say a year or 2 years ago?
That's a good question, right? I think actually both the good and the bad, right? I mean, starting with the good, I think what would have been helpful to know earlier is that, kind of what Brendan was saying, that there was a lot more space to experiment, to innovate, to try, frankly. So, I mean, I'll give you an example, right? I mean, we start with kind of needs in some way, right? Rather than thinking about sort of the product you want, like what is it that we're trying to kind of fix right now, right? And those tend to be pretty consistent across sort of government, across the nonprofit sector, across investigative journalists that we work with. The needs are kind of the same, right? So transplants across. So, I mean, it's things like, you know, we had a big problem. We operate in many of the same ways as a government agency would, right? So we're taking in huge amounts of data from all over the place, right? So we have like a vertical problem, which is how do you kind of make sense of if you get an entire corporate registry worth of data, which is like 1 billion rows, hundreds of properties, how do you find what you're kind of looking for in there? On the other side, you know, we have people going out around the world, all over the place, and sort of collecting data in like different ways, right? Like somebody's getting a USB, somebody's getting it on their hard drive, et cetera. So what we found is like probably like 30–40% of our data is like sitting on somebody's hard drive or sitting on somebody's like local thing here and a USB there, et cetera. And again, these challenges are not exactly the same, but the needs are kind of the same, right? So it gave us kind of the opportunity, I think, and we started late on this. If, you know, I think we started earlier in really understanding that if we solve these challenges, our influence comes from there. I think we'd have run a lot faster, quite frankly. Gotcha. So, you know, I kind of wish I'd known that.
Thanks. Peter, tell us more about the demand for this kind of mentoring and help across the DoD and how Second Front is helping with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that if you're executing through other transactions and it's exempting you from the FAR, sometimes you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So, you know, I think especially among, call it, you know, more junior folks in the government that can get frustrated with kind of the Byzantine acquisition system, there's such a frustration with the process that their initial first response is no process, right? And that's a bad answer, right? For kind of low-hanging fruit or some of the other things, it works fine. But as soon as kind of scrutiny starts to come, that really starts to break down. So one of the things that we've been asked to do is on the back end of some of these innovation shops, right, where these companies are coming out and don't necessarily have a clear path to end up long-term with a mission partner, or another thing that we're seeing and that we actually help with from a cybersecurity perspective, is you have companies and they're focused on, say, you know, building an autonomous sailboat, right? By being exempted from the FAR to do government contracting, they're not required to come up to a baseline of cybersecurity. With regards to NIST or FedRAMP or anything else, right? It's prohibitive for them. They're focused on their minimal viable product, right? They're thrilled to get a contract with the government. They get splashed all over somebody's government website, right? Or it gets publicized, and they find themselves immediately with an advanced persistent threat, right? So one of the things that we come in and do is before that announcement gets made, we come in and help just wrap them and protect them with cybersecurity. So that's an example of where we come
Sure,
in.
great.
So I wish I'd known that too, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And Candace, one other point I'll add in here, again, kind of back to your question, but to also amplify what both Peter and Varun said, and that is that what we also do is try to encourage the smaller companies, and when I say smaller companies, I mean really anything kind of below $100 million in revenue, which, you know, sounds large in many ways, but is small comparatively speaking with government. But that said, to find good channel partners and mentors as companies, meaning not every company needs to necessarily have, of course, and most don't, a prime contact with the government. In fact, in many ways, it's a waste of time. Yeah. Use resellers, use VARs, use channel partners, use contractors, use primes, use systems integrators to then kind of fold into what they're doing on either a program of record or a much larger development program, because it's just not only a whole lot easier because you can track with them, but at the same time, to your point, Peter, you don't have to be completely compliant with every government regulation in the FAR And so, you know, most companies don't want to have to spend $1 million, $2 million plus, they can't, to be compliant with DCAA. I mean, just not in their plan today. Maybe in 5 years, 10 years, but not today. And so we encourage them very much to kind of find their go-to-market channel partners or mentors, as I said, on a corporate basis to really help them kind of work their way through the system.
Great, thank you. I want to turn to the audience now and see if you have any questions, either for our entire panel or for a specific person here, given what you've heard today.
I'm curious if any of you have had any success using GPC. I realize it's only 3,000, 3,500, but maybe there's something you could do with data consulting or something that would be that low and easier in terms of.
Okay, did you guys hear the question with using GPC?
I haven't, no.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, sorry. And I cannot see anyone, so if you're all standing up to ask questions, I can't tell. I would be curious to hear, especially from we've got such a great mix here as well with government, industry, and startups.
So one thing, a point I'll just add on the VC is something that's been surprising for me, right, is, you know, if you look traditionally at VCs, you know, there was some willingness to deal with InQtel, the CIA's venture arm, because it was more agile, but in general there was kind of an aversion. You can actually put a number on that. VCs, when they were looking at acquiring a company, would discount anything that was government in their pipeline by 75%, right?
Correct.
Commercial got discounted, you know, basically nothing. So doing business with the government from a VC perspective, because of how long, you know, what a black box process it was, all the things that could go sideways, was not very highly valued. That started to change with some of the recent activities, which is a really great sign, because if government can crowd in venture investing and not have to bear both the startup funding risk as well as the life cycle costs of these technologies, and can have them being accelerated by commercial timelines, that's obviously highly advantageous. The thing that's really surprised me that I've seen that I did not expect is you now have venture funding for companies where their primary market is in fact the government, right? So this is sort of the Palantir model, but you're seeing it with companies now like Anduril or Shield AI, or companies that are doing deep, you know, scraping the deep and dark web, things that really do have more of a government focus. So I'd just say for maybe some of the smaller companies in the room where their primary market is government, and they haven't really thought about approaching the venture capital community, that's something you might actually want to reassess.
Well, and,
I was going to ask Peter, what do you think of the signaling of Techstars U.S. Air Force, for instance? Do you think we're at the beginning of something much larger where government entities and departments are going to start partnering with incubator programs to live out or do R&D faster and without the constraints of the traditional model? Is that something we're going to see much more of, you know, 5-10 years from now?
Yeah.
Let's start with, if you'll say what Techstars is and an incubator generally.
Yeah, so Techstars is a seed accelerator. It takes a small cohort of around 10 companies. The number can vary. It infuses them with capital. It infuses them with mentorship and connections, various resources. And over the course of 3 months, similar to a boot camp, brings that company from concept to market to have a much greater chance of success and securing certain deals and navigating waters that were maybe unfamiliar.
Yeah, I think if you look at the different types of funding that are out there for a company, you know, from basically getting like applied or basic research from organizations like DARPA to seed and angel funding, right? If you kind of map all this out, you would find that you have kind of these natural ridges and valleys. And surprisingly, if you lash up what's available from the commercial sector and what's available from the public sector, they line up pretty nicely, like, you know, kind of gears or whatever. So it just shows the value of, as the government ecosystem and the tech ecosystem start to move closer together, you know, we can achieve kind of what Israel's achieved, where they're punching above their weight. Specifically with Techstars and kind of the incubator model, I think, and we actually helped the Air Force think through this when they were trying to figure out where does an incubator fit, right? You know, doing a incubator, for instance, for AI would be silly, right? There are 780 funded AI companies out there. the US government overwhelmingly spends their AI dollars in the Beltway, which is not where typically the AI centers of excellence are. You know, it's out there, right? There's no reason for them to do an AI accelerator. In areas where there is a high level of VC interest, right, and there is a high mission demand signal, right, like counter drone, but there is a dearth of startups, that is actually where, you know, having the Air Force come in and have a national security accelerator makes a tremendous amount of sense. And, you know, just like anything else, if you have somebody like Techstars that actually knows how to do that process, there's no reason to try and reinvent the wheel yourself. Better to partner with somebody like them. Yeah.
Great. And Brendan, it sounds like, so all that we're hearing today, it sounds like the challenges stem from 3 areas. There's the strategically, how do you work with the federal government or with the public sector? How do you do that tactically? Like, how do you actually contractually do that? And then there's the cultural challenges. It sounds like you've tackled all 3 of them simultaneously. Were any of those more difficult? Did you even realize that that was sort of the approach? Does that ring true?
I started my first business when I was 13 years old and failed tremendously time and time again. So in a lot of ways, the failure that existed you know, in the early years of my life have given me visibility into how to navigate certain areas, but I owe so much to my mentors and the teams around me, and you know, gratitude to the AWS public sector team on navigating the White House Historical Association project. Like, those types of experiences really mold you as an entrepreneur. I mean, we're a 9-person company, and so to be able to take on a variety of different sectors and, you know, do it well, survive the sales cycle, and to continue to innovate is, you know, one of the great challenges of growing any company. So, you know, I again owe a lot of it to the systems around the company, and surrounding yourself with great partners, mentors, and investors can really, you know, make for smoother waters as you grow.
Sure. Varun, how about you? Anything, did you find yourself having to tackle these challenges from multiple
you said
directions?
Culture, what was the other?
I was thinking, you know, it seems to me it's strategic,
Yeah.
tactical, and then the cultural challenges.
I think the cultural one was the hardest. And again, it was kind of on a little bit what Andy and Peter were sort of talking about, was you have to think about, when you're working with the public sector, you have to think about a much broader range of issues than you would necessarily think about if you're doing it on the private side, right? So just all the little regulations that come with things, the integrations, if you're building this, is this going to integrate with this?
Yeah.
You know, you're redundant. You're always doing it for like one user, basically, creating a whole set of integrations just to deal with Treasury, for example, or deal with somebody else.
Sure.
So that was a bit of a challenge because, you know, again, you want to fail fast, you want to keep moving, but you do have to moderate yourself slightly, right? You don't have to sort of slow down completely down to sort of where they're at, but you do have to slow down to a certain extent. You do have to take a little bit of a broader look, and you do have to kind of put your lawyer hat on a little bit more often than you maybe would otherwise. Yeah. So I think that's been one of the
great. Thank you.
ones.
Got a question?
Please.
Hi, thank you very much. I was just wanting to press you all a bit more on the potential role of non-dilutive capital, both obviously things like SBIR grants,
Yeah.
but also potentially grants from foundations and other philanthropic organizations that want to see innovation in certain highly regulated sectors like transportation or environmental.
Sure.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah,
Andy?
sure. I'll start at least, and that is that highly encouraged from our standpoint, meaning, you know, when we approach a company or invest in a company, you know, certainly we've taken a position. We look at SBIRs, grants, other kinds of non-dilutive capital, really almost as revenue, and it certainly gives them, the companies, smaller companies in particular, a leg up and experience with the government. It's in some ways a bit of an enabler or even an accelerator, so it's a great thing to do. One thing that we, of course, caution against, and this is not necessarily the case all the time, but just to kind of watch out for, which we certainly do, and that is there are a lot of companies out there that end up being what I would call professional experimenters and tinkerers, meaning they get R&D grants, SBIR grants, and other types of of small business enablement, and they just continually kind of churn that model without really then commercializing and becoming, you know, kind of a productized delivery in the marketplace with real traction and revenue. So at some point you have to kind of break out of that, but as a, let's say, an augmentation or a bolstering of the marketplace, fully support that, 100%.
I'd also say that, you know, for instance, if In-Q-Tel is investing in a company, often the VC community will use that as a signal of kind of a seal of good housekeeping, right? And so that can often crowd in investing. We actually have a platform that we've built out that we use government tech scouts can use to basically do dual use tech research. So we see a lot of the different metrics around different raises, and companies that have, for instance, received DARPA money, right, then go off to have typically much more successful A rounds. So absolutely, if you're able to have that dual use tech sector appeal, it is a really advantageous position to be in.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
And I'll add actually one more point there as well, and that is that, again, you know, small companies, we all understand, can, for most part, you know, focus on one thing at a time, so to speak, in terms of their product development and development of the company itself in terms of scaling it up. Sometimes the government agencies, and this is where you have to also be careful where you coach the companies, and that is not to overwhelm them, because you might get a grant, but then that grant's going to take you in a direction you may not necessarily want to go in, and it absorbs all your time, energy, and resources. And you got to be careful to kind of keep your eye on the ball with the company that you have that you're developing and scaling in a certain direction. Yeah.
I think the one thing I'd add to that is just on the philanthropy or the foundation side of things, which is where, you know, we have a little bit more sort of exposure. I think what we've seen in the last few years is, let's say a couple things. I mean, firstly, like, there is a huge amount of money there. I think more than people anticipate sometimes. So, I mean, just an example, I mean, we do a lot of work in like ivory trafficking. 2 foundations put $75 million a year behind sort of ivory trafficking. These are just 2 individual people's foundations, right? So there's a tremendous amount of money there. But I think broader than that, what we're seeing is an increasing desire to shift away from sort of the old FTE model of resourcing, right? Because it was always about sort of putting butts in seats, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to sort of fund. I think there's now this shift, you know, you call it impact investing, call it whatever, but when you're starting with the idea that you want to achieve sort of impact, I think a lot of donors are more willing to fund, you know, software solutions, technology solutions, things that they probably wouldn't have in the past because they were kind of out there. I think that's really starting to change. So potentially that's unlocking, you know, a good amount of value. It certainly is for us.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're just about out of time. Let's close out with, I feel like you've all given some great advice and information to our audience here. If we could start with Brendan and move back this way. Let's just give your best piece of advice that you would, as a takeaway to our audience.
Surround yourself with a great productive ecosystem that you can learn from, whether it be channel partners or becoming more customer centric, so that you can make sure that you have the finger on the pulse of what really matters to the buyer, what really matters to your customer, and never go in blind in that aspect.
Great. Varun.
I'd say, you know, don't get discouraged, because I think there will be a lot of sort of pitfalls along this path. And I think the second thing, if you're operating sort of the Beltway, like, have a wide network, because you need to kind of touch these things from multiple different angles before you can kind of close what you need.
Great.
I would mention 2 things, actually. One I've already mentioned, but just to reiterate, and that is patience. But in addition to that, and that is to really understand what you're getting into, meaning don't take it lightly. It is sometimes challenging. It's long-term, as we've talked about in some cases. And so you kind of have to make a commitment. It's not the kind of thing you can dabble in. So you really need to make a corporate level decision about whether or not you want to be in this business or not.
In 1994, Congress passed a law for streamlining acquisition. This was as a result of the you know, $75 toilet seat and the $100 hammer type of thing. Palantir used that like 2 or 3 years ago to actually sue the Army and won. And that case didn't just affect the Army, it affected U.S. government, right? And it was an enforcement by the courts of that 1994 law, which said that you must prove that the commercial sector can't provide it commercial off the shelf or modified off the shelf before you go out and have something that already exists be custom built for you. So I would just say for the government folks or for people that are involved with government, you know, don't treat that as another check in the box obligation, but actually treat it as an opportunity to engage through interlocutors or directly through you know, big data and all sorts of things to understand truly what is out there. And then secondly, for the private sector, or rather for the small businesses in the room that are focused on government, I would just reiterate what I said, which is, you know, I think as increasingly you see InQtel and DIUX and these other efforts having an impact for venture capitalists, you know, if VC funding wasn't something that you thought was possible, and it probably wasn't in the past, it may be in the future, and that's something that can really accelerate your business, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of the type of mentorship that you're all talking about as well.
Thanks. Well, I hope everyone came away with something you didn't already know, and or at the least are just even buoyed or encouraged by what you're hearing here. Thank you all to our panel.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And thank you for attending.
That's great.